Hey, this is Ish, and in today's talk, I'll be going over the pros and cons of being extremely low in conscientiousness. And conscientiousness is one of the big five personality type traits. So, conscientiousness can be defined as the propensity to follow socially prescribed norms for impulse control, to be goal directed, planful, the ability to delay gratification, and also to follow norms and rules. And conscientiousness is made up of six different facets, which are cautiousness, self discipline, dutifulness, orderliness, self efficacy, and achievement striving. Now, what happens if you're very low on these traits? That's something that I've definitely experienced every time I've taken a Big Five personality type test. I score anywhere between 0 to about 7 or 12 in some cases. So I'm on the very low side of conscientiousness. And there are some benefits actually of being very low in conscientiousness, in addition to obviously the cons. And oftentimes, when we look at the Big Five personality type test, we often see the cons of being very low in conscientiousness listed everywhere. But I also think some of the pros aren't emphasized as much. So I'll go over that in a second. And I like to think of conscientiousness as your control muscles. And if you're low in conscientiousness, this means you are engaging more of your release muscles and letting go. So I think that's a contrast here because if you look at all the facets and things that relate to conscientiousness, they all have to do with being very controlled in life. And there are some benefits of actually letting go of this perceived uh, illusion of control. So let's look at some of the advantages or pros of being very low in this trait. So the first is you're extremely playful, spontaneous, adventurous, the life of the party, especially if you're very high in extroversion as well. And I think this really stands out in today's society because a lot of people can become very rigid and controlled and very stiff as a result of being very high in conscientiousness. So oftentimes with conditioning due to our society and our culture and upbringing or extreme work-oriented cultures where we're expected to just work all the time, we can actually end up becoming very stiff and rigid and overly controlled as a result of this. And we can look into these people that are super relaxed and carefree as a source of inspiration because they really stand out in that type of culture. And as kids, we're actually just naturally free and playful and we're just spontaneous. And we lose these aspects of ourselves as we get older and we're forced to do things like set goals and focus on our achievement orientation, and we become more rigid and controlled and take more responsibilities, and we lose that carefree fun aspect of ourselves. So when we're low in this trait, we become a source of inspiration for other people because we're just, free. And this freedom is just very attractive. Now, the next advantage of being very low in conscientiousness is that since you are less dutiful or orderly, you tend to be more non-conventional because you aren't necessarily looking for what the group thinks for advice or for guidance. And because of this, you're able to look at the world through your own eyes and your own perspective and come up with solutions that may have not otherwise been present. Because if we recall, conscientiousness is a propensity to follow socially prescribed norms for various things. So when we're not looking to the collective or what the group thinks, we're able to come up with other things and new innovative solutions for society that just wasn't there. And many of the great revolutionaries, free thinkers, sages are all people that have broken apart from what the group thinks and some of the social norms that they prescribed and actually said, okay, this isn't how I see things. And I think this is actually a better way. And they were able to come up with things that just wasn't taught before. Many of the great spiritual leaders are like this as well. The Buddha, for example, had found that when he left society and practiced on his own and started to think for himself, he was able to gain the spiritual knowledge and wisdom. And when he became enlightened, he actually hesitated for a second because he thought that no one would even understand what he was trying to teach and there was no use. And he was very reluctant to teach what he had learned so far. But then he had a change of heart and he had said that, okay, well, there are many people in the world with a lot of dust in their eyes and they wouldn't understand. But there are those with little dust, and for those people, I'll give my teachings. And it was then that he decided to teach his former ascetics that he practiced with. And that was the first sermon that he gave was a fire sermon. And he started to give his teachings there. And a similar thing also happened to sages Lao Tzu and Confucius, where they were about to leave society because they just thought that no one would understand their spiritual wisdom that they had started to experience. So Confucius actually went through periods of exile where he just left town and was like, I'm leaving. And Sage Lao Tzu was about to leave the kingdom he was in before he was stopped by a guard who wanted to know his teachings before he left. So they caught him right before he left, and that was the story behind how Taoism spread and his teaching spread from the Tao Te Ching. Now, one of the next advantages, or could also be a con, which I'll cover in a second, is fearlessness, and on the other side of the coin is recklessness. So I'll cover that in the con section. So cautiousness is part of conscientiousness, as we learned earlier. And if you are very low in this trait, you tend to throw caution to the wind, as they say. So here you're not really mindful of the consequences and you just go for things. And this could also be a good thing because you're able to take risks. And risks are uncertain because you don't know the outcome of how things are going to happen, but you take the chance anyway. And sometimes it can actually be very favorable, and sometimes maybe not. But I think if you learn over time, if you're very low in conscientiousness and take how to take calculated risks, this can actually produce more favorable outcomes. And as you learn to be mindful and weigh the risks out a bit more, because fearlessness is a very powerful quality and it can really shake things up and change things for the good in your favor because you just never know what happens. And all of life is very uncertain, but acting in spite of this uncertainty is what gives you confidence. Now, the last advantage of being very high in conscientiousness is being very laid back and the ability to roll with the punches and being very adaptable. So, like I mentioned earlier, when you're low in conscientiousness, you tend to be very laid back and you're emphasizing a lot of your release muscles as opposed to the control muscles. And when you do this, there's a certain sense of wisdom to this where you're able to let go of life and you know that you'll be okay. Because oftentimes the need to be overly controlled can come from a place of pain early on when you didn't feel safe in your childhood and you had to overly control for outcomes. So you'll notice actually, it's kind of interesting to notice that a lot of the hyper successful people who are very high in conscientiousness tend to have childhoods where they didn't feel safe or they didn't feel like they had control over things. So they had to compensate by being overly controlled and overly rigid. And some of the wisdom of letting go of all that and some of the spiritual wisdom here is that when you let go of the reins, you'll actually notice that you're okay. Life will somehow take care of itself when you let go of being overly controlled. Now, this also doesn't mean you just don't do anything and just say, I give up and you just let go. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you can let go of the need for attachments, for things being a certain way, so letting go of outcome. And if you simply take action, but also let go of the outcome, this is where the spiritual wisdom comes in. And this is talked about in Bhagavad Gita, for example, where Lord Krishna says to Arjuna, you are entitled to the action, but not the fruit of your action. And this is a really spiritual wisdom right here because you're taking action, but you're letting go of attachment. And you don't have to control every single outcome and how things happen. And when you let go, you'll actually be pleasantly surprised that life will be okay. And it turns out pretty well when you let go of the need to just control everything. So this is the deeper lesson there. Now, let's look at the cons or disadvantages of being extremely low in conscientiousness. And I'm sure you've probably heard this often, but conscientiousness is linked to antisocial behavior or crimes. It can be, at least. And I know when I was younger, this quality of recklessness and being defiant was definitely in me, especially being low in agreeableness when I was younger. And I didn't really care about fitting into any customs or following any tradition or organization. I didn't really care about school. And, skipping classes. Was defiant to authority, just didn't care at all. And this can obviously cause some negative consequences. And like I mentioned earlier, being reckless is also the flip side of being very fearless because you have no regard for the consequences. You're just taking risks. You can also take on certain life choices that aren't very conducive to your well-being, and because you're looking at the very short-term benefits of things and not looking at the long term. This could also be very harmful. So very low levels of conscientiousness is also linked to things like substance abuse, addictions, unhealthy habits, because again, you're very low in caution and also self-discipline. I've definitely struggled with this. And according to a multi-decade study begun in 1921 by a psychologist named Louis Terman, and they studied here over 1,500 adolescents in California. And what they found was that the strongest predictor of long life was conscientiousness. So, specific behavior associated with low conscientiousness may explain its influence on longevity, he says. So, there are 9 different behaviors that are among the leading causes of mortality. So, this will include alcohol use, disordered eating, such as obesity, drug use, lack of exercise, risky sexual behavior, risky driving, tobacco use, violence, and suicide. So these are all predicted by low conscientiousness. So you can see there's a potential to, especially when you're younger, to engage in these very risky behaviors or just not think of the consequences and just say, let's just do it. I've definitely been in many unsafe situations because of this. But as you get older and you become more mindful, you'll start to see and start to look into these things and examine the consequences behind certain actions. So this is where I talked about earlier, um, being able to assess the risks behind your actions and the outcomes behind whatever you do. And this becomes easier as you gain more experience in life and see the benefits and the consequences behind your actions. And then the next disadvantage of being very low in conscientiousness is procrastination. So this mindset of, I'll do it tomorrow, because you're very low in self-efficacy and achievement striving. And the problem is that you'll keep pushing your dreams aside for next day and next day and next day. But this future where you'll actually do the things, it just never comes because you've trained the muscle of putting things off. So you can actually learn practically how to become more efficient by stacking small wins in your favor and also lowering the threshold for your success. So instead of saying to yourself, all right, I'll, write this book that I'm working on, or write this paper, instead just say to yourself, okay, I'm going to write 10 words per day. A very achievable goal, and actually do it. Or instead of saying, okay, I'm going to go to the gym every single day this week, and it just never happens, just say, okay, I'm going to go for a walk for 5 minutes and stack that win. And by stacking these very small, achievable goals and accomplishing that, what happens is that you gain in your confidence, your area of control starts to increase. You feel that you can do things as opposed to you can't do anything. And this locus of control and stacking this momentum starts to increase. And as you gain momentum, you'll naturally be able to do more, and your confidence in your abilities actually increases more. So this is what I recommend, and I talk about this often, is that stacking small wins in your favor is very powerful, and I recommend that you do that. And the last con I'll bring up is that you can tend to lose things all the time, since you don't tend to be the most organized if you're very low in conscientiousness. So this can also be a problem as well. And generally, like I mentioned, the negatives or disadvantages of being very low in conscientiousness tends to be removed as you get older, as you gain more wisdom, more life experiences. And you'll see a slight rise in your conscientiousness as you get older as well. And this is called intrinsic maturation, is what psychologists talk about, is that there are certain traits of the Big Five personality type test model that change as you get older. So one of that is conscientiousness. Another of that is also agreeableness as well. So you start to become a kind person, more loving, and you feel that you want to contribute more to the world as you get older and just share what you've learned. And I think these are all very good things. But again, you can also keep some of the advantages of being very low in conscientiousness if you tend to fall that in that aspect. Because where you fall within the Big Five personality type test model tends to remain somewhat stable over time. So if you're extremely low in conscientiousness, you're not all of a sudden going to be very like rigid and controlled. Um, you will definitely gain in your ability to be more achievement focused, more goal oriented, and all these things, and more cautious. And that can be trained, but you just won't naturally just change into a completely hyper conscientiousness person over time. And you do want to also play with your strengths as well. So you can certainly see in my journey, coming from over 10 years ago where I didn't have this channel, I was completely disorganized, lazy, compared to now where I'm slightly more organized, more focused on my goals, things that I'm working on, but it's not all the way. So I'll leave you with that. Uh, Let me know what your score is on conscientiousness if you've ever taken a test and some of the things that you've learned in the comments. Thank you for watching this.